Australia has the most lethal wildlife on Earth, but that's not what kills you there. It's the people. And this entire horror masterclass is going to prove it. 8 bodies, barrels of acid, an abandoned bank vault, and a man who told the people who recruited to help him murder what they were doing was justice. The neighbors knew him. The neighborhood kids played at his house. He had barbecues. He laughed loudly and a lot. His name was John Bunting, and he killed 12 people between 1982 and 1999 in the suburbs of Adelaide, South Australia. Not in the outback or somewhere remote, right there in the Housing Commission streets. And there's a film about it, so brutal and so documentary and forensically close to actually what happened that the lead actor said he needed therapy after filming Wrapped. That's just one entry on today's list. We haven't even started counting yet. I'm Dr. Nika. You're in the Dominion, and today we're going to Australia, a country that took the most disturbing true crime in its history, the most isolated landscape on the planet, and a cultural silence around violence so deep it became its own kind of horror and turned all of it into cinema that the rest of the world wasn't ready for. Here's what I want you sitting with in the first second. What does it do to a country's psyche to live in a continent where everything, the snakes, spiders, jellyfish, and all the creatures of the sea, and the distance can kill you? Where the landscape itself is hostile, where you can disappear into the outback and nobody will find you for years? It makes a specific kind of human. And Australian horror knows exactly who that human is. Before the countdown, I need to give you something. Because Australian horror doesn't come from the same place as any other horror we covered in this channel. It's not Italian horror's fascination with aestheticized violence and memory. It's not French horror's war on the body as a political act. It's not German and Nordic horror of obsession with ordinary people hiding extraordinary capacity for evil. Australian horror is built on something simpler and more specific: the land, and the silence the land creates. Here's what most people don't understand about Australia geographically: it's about the same size as the continental United States, and roughly 90% of it is totally uninhabited. The interior, what Australians call the outback, is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. It's where you run out of water and nobody comes, where your car breaks down and there's no signal for miles in any direction, where a man or a woman don't want to discriminate. I mean, if we want to get technical, then men have more strength. But anyway, a person who could take you off a road and do whatever they want to do, and your body won't be found for years, if ever. The British colonists who arrived in 1788 named this continent from the Latin word for south. They didn't ask the people already living there what it was called. What followed? The systematic destruction of Aboriginal Australian culture, the stolen generations, the frontier massacres that Australian textbooks spent over a century not discussing, is a historical record of what happens when a colonial power decides that a people and their land are resources to be consumed. Before you say anything, let me say this is not me saying all this. These are the things that the directors and writers and the artists are trying to say. So, anyway, that history doesn't go away. It sits under the surface of everything, under the red earth, under the suburban lawns, under the barbecue culture and the easygoing national myth. And Australian horror keeps digging it up. There's also the myth, the larrikin, the she'll be right culture, the aggressive performance of easygoingness that hides, clinically speaking, a very specific kind of suppressed affect. Australia carries a real and documented mental health burden. About 1 in 5 Australians between 16 and 85 experience a mental disorder in any given year. That's the ABS's own number. Mental illness accounts for 13% of the country's total disease burden. Alcohol is above the OECD average in per capita consumption and consistently ranks as the most common drug driving people into treatment. And in rural and very remote Australia, rates are more than double those of major cities. And the research shows that up to a quarter of those deaths involve people with undiagnosed mental illness, people who never made it into the system at all. The silence isn't metaphor, it has a body count. And also, the country that presents to the world that it's the most relaxed place on earth has a high rate of domestic violence. That's the wound Australian horror presses on. The gap between the sunny national mythology and what's actually happening in the houses behind the lawns. The wide open landscape that should mean freedom but functions as a trap. The friendliness conflict, the distance that means screaming doesn't matter. That's your frame. Now let's count down. We start with the one most people haven't seen, or if you have, that's why you're in the Dominion. And I'm putting it number 10 because it's the quietest entry on this list. Not gentle, there's a difference. Lake Mungo, 2008. Shot as a mockumentary, the same format as a real grief documentary. Interviews with family members and found footage and home videos about a family dealing with the drowning death of 16-year-old Alice, her parents, her brother, and their therapist. Their interview after the fact, trying to make sense of what happened and why the house feels wrong after Alice died. And then they start finding things on Alice's phone, things she recorded, things she was doing that they didn't know about, a life she was living that her family had no access to. Here's why this film is on the list and why it belongs in the beginning. It's the only entry today that's disturbing purely through grief, through the specific devastating experience of losing someone, and then discovering that the person you lost was also a stranger, that the version of your child you thought you knew was a curated version, that behind the face she showed at breakfast every morning, there was another person entirely. Every parent in the world who watches this film will feel something land in their chest that doesn't move for days. Every teenager who watches it will feel something else, the recognition of keeping a private self, of having a life that your family doesn't know exists, and the specific dread of what happens if they find out after you're gone and can explain yourself. What Anderson does clinically is capture what we call disenfranchised grief, grief that can't be properly mourned because the mourner doesn't know who they're actually mourning for. Alice's family loved her, but they're not sure that they knew her, and that uncertainty makes the grief impossible to close. There's no clean ending to the warning because they keep uncovering another layer of who Alice was. The documentary format makes it feel real that goes past the genre entirely. The film has one specific scene, a piece of footage on a phone, that's one of the most quietly terrifying images in modern horror. I'm not describing it, you need to find it yourself. Dread scale 6 out of 10 on the surface, 9 out of 10 the next morning. Number 9 is the film that invented Australian horror, the one that set every rule this entire tradition lives by. And the most famous thing about it is what happened when it screened in Australia for the first time. An audience member stood up in the theater, pointed at the screen, and shouted, "That's not us." Actor Jack Thompson, who was in the cast and happened to be in the audience, told him, "I wish I could do the accent. Sit down, mate." That exchanges the whole film in 2 lines. Waken Fright, 1971, a Canadian, which matters because this film could only have been made about Australia by someone who didn't live inside the mythology. A young British schoolteacher, John Grant, is posted to a tiny outback settlement and is counting the days until he get back to Sydney for the holidays. He stops overnight in a mining town called the Yaba on his way to the train. He loses all his money gambling in a single night. He can't leave, and the town doesn't want him to. What follows isn't a thriller in a traditional sense. Nobody chases him with a knife. No one threatens him openly. Instead, the Yaba just absorbs him. The men are friendly in a way that doesn't leave room to say no. They drink constantly. They push beers into your hand before you finish the one you're holding. They take you kangaroo hunting at 2 a.m., drunk, in the back of a ute with real rifles. The hunting scene uses footage of real kangaroo slaughter. It's not simulated. And 12 people walked out of the 2009 Cannes rescreening during it. John doesn't get taken prisoner. He just keeps making choices that slide him further from who he was. He drinks more than he needs to. He does things he wouldn't do sober. He wakes up in places he can't remember getting to. By the end of the film, he's almost completely unrecognizable. And the horror is that nobody forced him. The Yaba just made it easy to stop being the person he came in as. Clinically, this is one of the most precise cinematic depictions of what we call social identity erosion under sustained environmental pressure. The documented process by which the sense of self gradually loses coherence when the environment provides no mirrors, no feedback, no social structure to anchor identity against. John Grant in the Yaba has no one to be the teacher for, no one to dress for, or aspirations that matter. And without those external structures, the self starts to drift. The Yaba doesn't corrupt him, it just removes the scaffolding and watches what's left. The film was initially such a commercial failure in Australia that virtually every print vanished. The original negative went missing when the distributor went bankrupt. It was considered lost for decades. A print was eventually found in a Pittsburgh warehouse in the early 1990s, restored and re released, and then ranked by critics as one of the greatest Australian films ever made. The country that screamed "That's not us" in 1971 spent the next 50 years slowly admitting that it was. Dread scale, 7.5 out of 10. The horror doesn't announce itself, it just arrives very quietly while you're having another beer. Number 8 is the one that broke Australian horror internationally open and took it from a national conversation to a global one. The Babadook, 2014. Written and directed by Jennifer Kent, the first Australian woman to direct a horror film that received major international distribution. It premiered at Sundance. Roger Ebert's site called it one of the scariest films of the decade. I don't want to put my input in it too much, but I didn't like this film. It was boring. I tried 3 times. I couldn't. I know psychologically it's accurate, but that annoying kid, I just couldn't. But anyway, it became somewhat unexpectedly a gay pride icon, which is a whole separate fascinating cultural phenomena. Amelia is a single mother. Her husband died in a car accident on the way to the hospital while she was in labor with their son Samuel. That means every year on Samuel's birthday, she's also marking the anniversary of losing her husband. She never mourned him properly. She put it somewhere and keeps going. Samuel is difficult, anxious, obsessive, convinced there's a monster coming, making weapons to fight him. Waking her at 3 a.m., God, just let her masturbate. She's exhausted in a specific bone deep way of someone who hasn't slept properly in years and hasn't cried properly in years either. Then a book appears on the shelf, Mr. Babadook, pop up handmade. Nobody knows where it came from. The book describes a monster, and the monster starts showing up. Here's what I want you to understand, and what makes this entry essential on a psychology channel. The Babadook isn't a supernatural entity that the film asks you to take literally. Jennifer Kent has said this directly. The Babadook is grief. Specifically, it's the grief that Amelia chose not to feel. Compressed, suppressed, stored somewhere dark, and which the body eventually refuses to keep containing. In the trauma literature, this maps onto it. It's called grief avoidance with delayed onset presentation, the pattern where acute grief isn't processed at the time of the loss and resurfaces months or years later in a form that's significantly more disruptive than the original mourning would have been. The body keeps the score. If you won't feel the thing in the moment, it'll find another time. It'll find you. The film ends with Amelia not destroying the Babadook. She locks it in the basement and feeds it, tends to it, and that's the most clinically honest ending in grief horror. Because that's actually what recovery looks like. Not the elimination of grief, the management of it. Learning to live alongside of the thing in the basement rather than pretending it isn't there. What happened to Jennifer Kent after this film is also worth knowing. She spent years trying to get her follow up, The Nightingale, a film about colonial violence against Aboriginal Australians. Multiple Australian investors refused to fund it. It eventually got made anyway and was one of the most critically significant Australian films of 2018. When a country's own film industry won't fund a film about that country's real history, that tells you something about the wound. Dread scale 7.5 out of 10. The monster is real. The monster is inside you. That's worse. Number 7, Wolf Creek, 2005, Australia. Love this movie. And here's where the temperature changes completely. Before we get into the film, I need to tell you about Ivan Milat. Milat was a road worker from New South Wales. Between 1989 and 1993, he abducted and murdered at least 7 young backpackers traveling along the Hume Highway, mostly Europeans, doing what hundreds of thousands of young people do every year, traveling through Australia, hitchhiking, camping, experiencing the country. He buried them in Belanglo State Forests, south of Sydney. The first bodies were found in 1992. The last were found in 1993. Malat was arrested in 1994, convicted of 7 murders, and sentenced to life without parole. He died in prison in 2019 from esophageal cancer. He spent his final years in hospital handcuffed to his bed, smuggling hacksaw blades in his food, and removing his own finger with nail clippers in escape attempts. Wolf Creek isn't directly based on Malat's crimes. The filmmakers have been careful about that. But the film's DNA is entirely his. A remote Australian setting, young backpackers who accept help from friendly local, and a killer who's funny outback weather, a casual Australian before he's something else entirely. 2005, directed by Greg McLean. 3 friends, 2 British girls, 1 Australian, are camping in the remote outback near the Wolf Creek meteorite crater. Their car breaks down. Mick Taylor appears. He offers to fix their car and take them to his camp for the night. He's friendly. He laughs a lot. He makes tea. John Jarrett plays Mick Taylor. And if you know John Jarrett from Australian television, he was on Better Homes and Gardens, a lifestyle show. That knowledge sits in your chest in a very specific way, the whole film. He's the person you'd invite to fix your car. He's the person you wouldn't be afraid of. What McLean understood about outback horror that other filmmakers hadn't quite nailed is this: the isolation doesn't just function as a backdrop, it's an active element of the violence. When Mick has those backpackers, screaming truly doesn't matter. There's nobody within hundreds of kilometers. There's no signal or anyone coming. The distance between where they are and any form of help is itself a weapon Mick uses without ever picking it up. The land does work for him. That's the horror that's unique to Australia. The film was released in America on Christmas Day 2005. The distributor thought it was a good idea. It was. It got an off cinema score, the worst possible rating, assigned by opening night audiences who expected something else. Boring. It remains one of the most tone deaf release decisions in American film distribution history. I loved it. Clinically, what Wolf Creek is mapping in its villain is what forensic psychologists call predatory aggression with organized presentation. The specific offender type of pathology where violence is premeditated, controlled, and executed within a geographic comfort zone, which gives the perpetrator overwhelming advantage. Milk isn't impulsive. He's done it before. He knows what the outback will do for him logistically, and he chose it. Dread scale? 8 out of 10. The first 30 minutes are almost deliberate in their ordinariness, and that's the point. Number 6, Hounds of Love, 2016, Australia. And I want you to think about something as we go in. Most horror films where the couple are killers make the man the driver and the woman the passenger. The man is the primary predator. The woman is coerced, complicit, maybe conflicted, but ultimately following his lead. It's a well worn dynamic and it comes from a real forensic pattern. In a documented literature are parent killings. The male partner typically initiates, and the female partner typically participates under some combination of emotional control, fear, and attachment. Hounds of Love knows that dynamic intimately, and it makes the woman, not the man, the most psychologically complex and ultimately the most crucial element of the film. Western Australia, Perth suburbs, 1987. Based loosely on the real crimes of David and Catherine Burney, who between 1986 and 1987 abducted and murdered 4 women in Perth before fifth victim escaped. John and Evelyn are a couple living on a suburban street with neat lawns and a dog, and the kind of house you walk past without looking at twice. They drive slowly down streets near schools. They offer girls rides. Evelyn is particularly disarming, warm, easy, the kind of woman another woman might not feel immediately threatened by. Vicky is 17. She sneaks out to go to a party. She accepts the ride and wakes up chained to a bed. The film isn't primarily what John does to Vicky. It's about the relationship between John and Evelyn, specifically about the way John controls Evelyn, the way he degrades her when Vicky isn't watching, the way he isolates her from her own children, her mother, any external support, the way she performs confidence and threat in front of Vicky while John performs the same dynamic on her that they're both performing on their captive. There are 3 people in this house, and 2 of them are being controlled by the same man. That's the horror. Vicky understands this before the audience does, and her survival strategy, driving a wedge between John and Evelyn, appealing to Evelyn's suppressed maternal instincts, making herself real to the person who could save her, is one of the most psychologically sophisticated survival narratives in a horror film. She's doing crisis intervention over extreme distress. She's identifying the leverage point in a coercive controlled system and applying pressure to it. Clinically, what Ben Young is depicting in Evelyn is a textbook presentation of what we now call coercive control syndrome in intimate partner violence. The documented pattern where the controlling partner systematically removes the victim's external support systems, financial independence, sense of self worth, and access to alternative realities until the relationship becomes the only reality available. Evelyn isn't a monster who chose this. She's a woman who's been reduced to the point where participating in John's predatory behavior feels safer than the alternative. That doesn't excuse her. The film doesn't ask you to excuse her. It just asks you to understand how someone gets there. And that understanding is more disturbing than any amount of gore. Shot on a micro budget in suburban Perth, first time director, and one of the most controlled, precise pieces of Australian horror ever made. Tread scale 8.5 out of 10. I want to stop here because we're halfway through and there's a pattern worth naming. Look at what we've covered. Lake Mungo, a girl with a secret life her parents never knew about. Wakened Fright, a man who dissolves into a community that doesn't ask questions. The Babadook, a mother carrying grief she decided not to feel. Wolf Creek, a friendly local Hounds of Love, a nice looking couple on a suburban street. You know what's not on this list so far? The supernatural, the paranormal, the invented monster. Australia makes horror about real things. And the real things Australian horror keeps returning to are the same few. The isolation that makes you disappear, the friendliness that hides something, the house behind the lawn that nobody's looking into, and the silence that surrounds all of it. The she'll be right culture that means you don't talk about what's wrong until what's wrong has been wrong for a very long time. There's a clinical term for what that cultural pattern produces in individuals: affect suppression under social performance norms, the consistent internalization of distress driven by a social environment that codes emotional expression as weakness. Australia scores high on this in cross cultural psychology research. The same culture that produces some of the warmest, most self deprecatingly funny people in the world also produces an epidemic of silent suffering. The two things aren't separate, they're the same mechanism. And the films in the top five of this list are the ones that look directly at what silence costs. Number five, and this is where we shift from dread into something raw and louder and more deliberately confrontational. The Loved Ones, 2009, another favorite. Brent is a teenager who's been in a serious car accident that killed his father and who blames himself for it. He's depressed, self harming, barely functional. A girl at a school called Lola asks him to the prom. He says no, gently, because he's already going with his girlfriend. He doesn't think much about it after. Lola does. That night, Brent is abducted and wakes up at a dinner table in an isolated farmhouse, dressed for prom, tied to a chair. Across from him is Lola in a pink dress, done up like it's the best night of her life. At the head of the table is her father, who calls her princess and has clearly been helping her do this before. What follows is one of the most tonally specific horror films on this list: dark comedy and genuine brutality in the same frame, which is hard to pull off, and Byrne handles in absolute confidence. There's a handheld power drill used for things drillers shouldn't be used for. There's a coffee cup that functioned as the most effective piece of horror prop design in recent memory. And there's Lola, played by Robin McLavy, in one of the best villain performances. She's simultaneously hilarious and terrifying in a specific way that real documented female predatory narcissism actually presents. Total certainty that she's the center of the universe, total bewilderment when the universe disagrees, and the capacity of violence that comes from, not, it's not from malice, but from complete unquestionable belief that what she wants, she should have. Clinically, Lola presents with what we call malignant narcissistic features, with entitlement driven rage activation. She's not cunning or calculating in a way a psychopath typically is. She's grandiose in a way a child is when no one has ever told them no, but with adult physical capacity and a father who's spent her entire life making sure no one ever did tell her no. The horror of this film isn't primarily Lola, it's the father. Because Lola didn't build herself, he built her. The film got a release in America that barely existed, and that's sad. And word of mouth turned it into the most talked about horror films of the decade in genre circles. Byrne has made nothing since, which is its own kind of tragedy. Dread scale, 8.5 out of 10. One of the most entertaining films on this list, and one of the most unsettling simultaneously. Number 4. And I need to pause before this one and tell you what it cost to make it. Nitram is about the Poor Arthur Massacre on April 28, 1996. A 28-year-old man walked into a cafe at the Port Arthur Historic Site in Tasmania and opened fire. He killed 35 people and wounded 23 more. It remains the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history that I know of. The victims' families and survivors in years had to navigate media coverage and public discussion of the event. Several Australian networks refused to broadcast the film. There was serious public debate about whether it should be made at all. Director Justin Kurzel, who also made Snowtown, which we'll get to, and screenwriter Sean Grant made deliberate choice. They never name the perpetrator in the film. They call him Nitram. It's his childhood nickname, spelled backward, Martin, the name kids at school used to bully him. They refused to give him the dignity of his real name on screen. Caleb Landry Jones plays Nitram. He won Best Actor at Cannes for it, and the performance is genuinely one of the most difficult pieces of acting I've seen in this Australian film, because what Landry Jones had to do was make this man comprehensible without making him sympathetic. He had to show you the developmental history, the cognitive impairment that was never properly addressed, the social rejection that adds up over lifetime, the complete absence of any structural support system, the gun access laws that allows a severely disturbed individual to legally acquire military grade firearms without ever letting you forget about all these failures that produce. The gunshot scene is the most disturbing scene in the film, and it's because of the cheerfulness. The shop assistant who sells Nitram his weapons is friendly, professional, and helpful. He talks him through the options. He's doing his job. And what Frizzle does is hold on to that transaction, that completely legal, completely routine commercial exchange, long enough for you to understand exactly what legal gun ownership framework make possible when they don't include meaningful mental health screening. Australia changed its gun laws after this. John Howard's government introduced a national firearm agreement, bought back 650,000 guns, and made the legislative changes that virtually every public health expert in the world has since cited as the model of how a democratic government responds to a mass shooting. There hasn't been a comparable mass shooting in Australia since. Nitram doesn't have a single gun scene that isn't just watching the law fail in real time. That's the horror. The systems that was supposed to catch this person at any about 40 different points and didn't. Dread scale, 9 out of 10. This is the entry on this list that's going to make some viewers the most upset. It's not because of content. It's what asks you to think about off screen. Before we get to number two, I want to give you something that doesn't fit neatly on a single film entry because there's a category of Australian horror that I think deserves its own placement. And once I name it, you're going to immediately recognize exactly what I mean. The Australian suburban horror film, specifically the genre of films set not in the outback or isolated world settings but in the most ordinary looking residential streets in the country. And what they argue collectively is that the outback's isolation and hostility isn't unique to the outback. It's been replicated perfectly in the structure of Australian suburban life. The houses behind the lawns, the closed blinds, the noise ordinances that mean you don't hear what happens three doors down, the she'll be right cultural norm that makes asking, "Are you okay?" feel like an invasion, and which explains why warning signs so often go undiscussed until it's too late. Hounds of Love is the most precise example. Perth's more ordinary looking street concealing the most ordinary looking couple doing what they're doing. But you could also put the Babadook here, where it's isolated suburban grief house. You could put Killing Ground here and suburban mayhem and other Australian films that make the same argument. The vast, empty, lethal landscape you think of when you think of Australia, it's been imported into the suburbs. The houses just make it look domestic. This is clinically what we call ecological horror, the specific genre of dread. It wasn't about a particular monster, it's about a particular environment that's been stripped of the social support structures that make it safe. The Australian outback is ecologically hostile because of its physical properties. The Australian suburbs is hostile because of what it's socially designed to suppress. Every Australian filmmaker who set a horror movie on a suburban street is making this argument, and every one of them is right. Number two is the most important Australian film on this list, and I'd argue it's one of the most important crime films, Snowtown, 2011, directed by Justin Krizel, his debut feature, co-written by Sean Grant, based on the real murders at the beginning of this video. John Bunting, the barrels, the acid, the vault. What Krizel made in the first film with a tiny budget and a cast of non-professional actors from the actual communities where the crimes occurred is something that barely fits the word film. It feels like found footage that nobody was supposed to find. The story is told from the perspective of Jamie, the teenage son of Bunting's girlfriend, who became Bunting's protege, accomplice, and eventually one of the convicted killers. The film follows Jamie from the moment Bunting enters his family's life. Charming, protective, the male figure James' household had been lacking, through his gradual initiation into Bunting's worldview and eventually into Bunting's crimes. Here's what makes Snowtown categorically different from every other true crime film on this list, or anywhere else. Kurzweil made a deliberate decision not to frame it as a thriller. There is no dramatic music or tension. The violence, when it comes, isn't shot with horror grammar. There aren't any quick cuts or score spikes or angles that make you feel the violence is just happening in a bathroom, car, and everywhere you watch. The most notorious sequence in the film takes place in a bathtub. I won't describe it in detail, of course. I'll say it lasts long enough that several film reviewers were describing their experience of it, specifically mentioned checking the time. And it wasn't because how long it was running. It was just something objective to focus on. To be honest, I did get a little bored, but again, not about me. What Crizzle is mapping and bunting and what Daniel's performance delivers with complete horrifying precision is something that clinical literature on charismatic cult leaders and coercive control experts have documented extensively. The way that a specific type of personality and a specific type of socially depleted environment can position himself as the solution to every anxiety a vulnerable community carries. Bunting targeted housing streets. He gave his community a sense of power and righteous purpose. And then he used that sense of purpose to make them help him kill people. That isn't a serial killer. That's the mechanism of radicalization. And that's what every extremist recruitment operation from isolated suburbs to online hate forums uses as its basic engine. Find people who feel powerless. Give them a framework that explains why. Give them a designated enemy and give them a sense of belonging that depends on their continued participation in targeting that enemy. John Bunting killed 12 people. His greatest crime, in some ways, is that he made other people help him, that he manufactured killers out of people who were at the start of the process just lonely. The film was shot in the actual houses where some of these events occurred, with locals cast as themselves. Some of the neighbors of the real perpetrators appeared in background of scenes. Frizzle shots in sequence slowly over months to let the deterioration of the characters add up naturally rather than acting. It was too much for some people. Australian critics called it punishing, indulgent, necessary, and devastating. Sometimes in the same review, it's all of those things. Dread scale, 9.5 out of 10. And here we are, number one. And I'm going to do what I did with France and Germany and Italy. Give you the one that proves the thesis, the one that isn't the most explicit, the one that's most disturbing because of what it refuses to explain. Directed by Peter Weir, based on Joan Lindsay's 1967 novel. Set on Valentine's Day, 1900, a group of schoolgirls from Appleyard College, a repressive upper-class boarding school, travel by horse-drawn coach to Hanging Rock, a formation of ancient volcanic rock in Victoria, for a picnic. Three girls and one teacher climb up into the rock formation to explore. They don't come back. Nobody ever finds out what happened to them. The film doesn't tell you. The novel doesn't tell you either. Joan Lindsay wrote a final chapter that explained the disappearance, and her publisher persuaded her not to include it. It was published separately after her death in 1987. Read it if you want to. It doesn't close the wound. This is the only entry on this list with essentially no violence or crime. There's no forensic element. It's a film of heat and silence and white dresses and sound of the rock. Weir shot it with Vaseline smeared on the lenses, a shimmering dream quality that makes the whole film look like you won't understand it. Here's why it's number one. And I want you to really hear this argument. Every other film on this list gives you a perpetrator, a Mick Taylor, a John Bunton, Lola, Nitram, something to organize your dread around, something that has a psychology or behavior that you could analyze or explain. Horror cinema almost always does this. It gives you a monster, and the monster has a logic, even if it's a logic of pure evil. And that logic provides a container for the fear. Picnic at Hanging Rock takes the container away. The girls disappear into the ancient Australian landscape, and the land keeps them. There's no explanation or perpetrator or body to find. There's only the rock, older than European settlement, older than any human concept of ownership or justice, and the absence where the girls used to be, and the film keeps you returning to Hanging Rock, to its silence, to the heat shimmer, and offers you nothing. What does that to a viewer is something clinical and specific. It activates what called intolerance of uncertainty, the documented psychological state of what the absence of the resolving explanation is itself experienced as more threatening than a known negative outcome. We're wired to prefer a bad answer to a no answer. We rather know the worst than sitting in the not knowing. Picnic at Hanging Rock takes your no for the answer and just holds it for 115 minutes, and then the credits roll. The film is also doing something that the entire Australian tradition orbits. It's making an argument about the land. Specifically, the ancient Australian landscape isn't neutral. It doesn't care about European settlements or colonial scores or Valentine's Day picnics or border school girls. It was here before all of it, and it'll be here after. And sometimes the film doesn't say why. It takes something or someone and it doesn't give him back. It doesn't owe you an explanation. That's the boldest fear that Australia has, older than everything. The land, the silence, thing that was here before you and will be here after. Picnic at Hanging Rock doesn't give you a monster. It gives you the feeling that you are the one who doesn't belong, that the land has always known it, and that one day it might decide to make that clear. Dread scale, immersion over 10. This is where the scale stops making sense. Some horror is too old and too quiet for numbers. 10 entries, one continent, from 1971 to 2021. Here's the thing that stays with me at the end of a list like this. Every country we've done on this channel has its own wound. Italy has fascism, France has the body, Germany and the Nordic countries have the question of how ordinary people become capable of evil. Australia's wound is simpler and maybe harder to close. It's the silence, the cultural muscle memory of pretending things are fine, the outback myth that makes looking tough more important than saying the true thing, the landscape so enormous and indifferent that it's easy to feel like what happens in it doesn't matter, doesn't count, or won't be found. And what every filmmaker on this list did was refuse that, refuse the silence, put what happened on the screen and hold the camera on it and say, this happened here in this country, on this street, all of it. And you don't get to look away. That's what horror is for at its best, the refusal to look away. So tell me, which entry on this list is sitting in your chest right now? And it's not the one that scared you most, the one that's going to be there when you try to sleep. Drop it below. I read every single one. And if you made it this far, you already know you're in the Dominion. Fear is the only honest thing. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.